Hey, so you ever wonder why your hip pops in the way it does when you're getting to extreme range of motion, or maybe you get out of the car after a long car ride and you kind of wiggle? If you're in the passenger seat and it's your right hip, you'll kind of open up your right hip into external rotation and you get that pop. Well, here's what I think is happening, and then we'll get into some of these exercise package. First of all, like, the popping is irrelevant. If it's not associated with pain, it means absolutely nothing. It's also likely, and I'm going to paint a little picture here, that pop is related to a labral tear. And that labral tear is 100% completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of what you would do with a torn labrum. It doesn't need surgery. It doesn't need a cortisone injection. It doesn't need anything. And in fact, we may have, with an exercise approach, minimize these pops. And usually your hip moves better and it feels better. So here's what I think is happening, okay? So your hip, ball of head of the femur is in the socket. No labrum. Labrum makes it deeper. No labrum, yes labrum. No labrum, yes. Medial, lateral, okay? So now we're looking medial. And let's say there is a labral tear like this. And over time, the head of the femur kind of migrates in between the tear because it's a pressurized system. Everything always moves towards areas of less pressure from more pressure to create this evenness. So over time, if the femoral head is sitting a little bit inside that tear, not so much certainly where it can come out, because that's not possible, but just that little bit where all of a sudden the femoral head is no longer centrated. It's a little bit over here. So you've lost motion. And when you don't use motion over time, the contractile elements, the soft tissues, the connective tissues will also accommodate for this level of tension. So all of a sudden you have this big loss of hip internal rotation. And then all of a sudden you get out and do whatever exercise you do, or you just kind of give it a little wiggle, and then it pops. What I think is happening is this. Wiggle, 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 wiggle. And you hear that cracking your knuckle sound and feel, because it's certainly very, very real, even though snaps and pops and crackles don't even have to be real all the time. I believe this one is real, and that's why I think it's happening. So we saw this, and of course we're always going to treat what we see and what we think, but ultimately, as we're going through stuff, all of a sudden, a client's hip popped, patient is hip popped, and I'm like, hey, does it feel better now? He's like, yeah, and then his motion was better. So the construct here, because this was his complaint was just stiffness and just not comfortable range of motion. His range of motion wasn't bad, but it definitely wasn't as good as the other side. To me, that's already a flag, because sometimes it's easy to miss things when range of motion is good, but you're not looking at both sides, and you're not looking at the whole picture, because it's clearly not as good as the other side. And you're allowed to be asymmetrical, even if it's very meaningful, if you have a reason. We didn't even know anything yet here. So we did see significant improvement in internal rotation with needling, called glute medius, glute minimus, and a little bit of vastus lateralis into probably TFL, if that's what we're going to say. Okay, next. So what will we do? Now we've got some range of motion, and he's very, very happy. He felt more stable with different exercises that he chose to demonstrate that he would know. Not objective tests, his subjective tests. Which I always think are, if at worst, equally as powerful as some of the objective things. So we talk about he's going to do whatever soft tissue work he wants to do. Doesn't matter to me if it's me doing it. We are going to do some general mobilization. Here we have hip internal rotation and extension. That is a global postural stretch, global positional stretch. I don't even know what the P always stands for. And again, you can pick whatever. I think the big money here, though, is because he talked about doing a lot of mobility drills, but it doesn't work. Like he said, I would do hip internal rotation drills for an hour and it would feel okay, but never what I wanted. Because I think that we're primarily looking at the soft tissue. I think when you can really appreciate and understand, and somebody can execute an LDOA, that's where you're probably creating something more at the joint level, capsular level, and that's where this wonky little, annoying labral tear issue is going on. And we did LDOA, hip internal rotation, very, very effective. Follow that up with I call it half kneeling balance. You're just basically getting on probably a pad so your knee is not, pre-patella bursa is not going to be aggravated even on a soft mat. The RX pad might give you a little wobble. That's not the point at all. It's just something soft. So you can use a pillow or anything soft. And we're in different models, this would be called general proprioception of the hip. So that we're not specifically targeting any one structure, just overall. Now that you have this new hip, let's get better at keeping it centrated. Many exercises here, certainly many DNS exercises that would be very, very effective here. We just pick something very, very basic. We would also combine that from the top down because this individual also had a shoulder issue. So creating this stacked diaphragm over the pelvis with some basic 3.5 month stuff. He was doing it with his feet elevated onto a bench, totally fine. Probably more of Sarman level 1 stuff there, more so than, but again, like, it's just names and words. It's all the same. But then I think the bulk of where he can get aggressive is once he can maintain 2 minutes holding a kettlebell in inline half kneeling, back foot planar flex, so he has no help. He's basically standing on one leg on his knee, so we take the foot completely out of it. And once you can hold for 2 minutes, as close to inline as possible, that's when we do some very, very low level, from a load standpoint, diagonal patterns. You can do basic D1 and D2 when I say diagonal, but you see here we're talking about chops, lifts, using a mace if that's something that you're into, trunk rotations, halos, bottoms up kettlebell press where you're controlling the rotation rather than creating it. So all of that would be a very, very simple package for cranky hips that sometimes pop. So stiff hips that, but then when they feel better for when they pop, I think this can be a little bit of a package for you. Hope that makes sense. Anybody seen a leprechaun? Say yeah.